O'clock. Good morning and welcome to Downing Street. I'm Sean Lay. Here are the headlines. The new Prime Minister Liz Truss has held her first cabinet meeting after a reshuffle of the most senior positions in government. Ministers insist the energy crisis is at the very top of her agenda.
I think it's important that all the tyres are kicked, as it were, to make sure that we have a robust energy proposal in order, as I say, to set out that can be set out to help households and businesses, and details on that will be coming this week.
If Liz Truss announces that she's adopting Labour's plans, we welcome that and the country will welcome that, but we really haven't got the detail.
In 1 hour's time, Liz Truss will head to the House of Commons for her first appearance as the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's Questions.
I'm Joanna Gosling. In the studio are other headlines this morning. The former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs is to face a retrial on domestic violence charges. The mother of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell appeals to the gunman who killed her daughter to hand himself in. From today, free meals are being introduced for the youngest pupils at primary schools in Wales. Chelsea have sacked their manager following a poor start to the season and a 1-0 Champions League defeat to Dinamo Zagreb last night.
Welcome to Downing Street, the heart of British government in London, as the Prime Minister's arrival and departure of her cabinet and cabinet colleagues is watched by a phalanx of journalists and camera crews, reporting this news of the new administration, not just for the UK, but for viewers around the world. Now, the big changes that have come about with Liz Truss's arrival in Downing Street are the personnel around the cabinet table. 24 ministers serving in cabinet, plus another half a dozen who attend cabinet. Here's the picture released by Downing Street a short time ago. You can't see most of the big faces. It's famously a coffin-shaped table, nobody knows why, and sitting at the left in the middle is the Prime Minister. But the two most prominent figures at the front of this particular picture are James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, on the left, and Tom Tugendhat, former leadership rival to Liz Truss, who is now the Minister of Security. They're not members of the Cabinet, but they will attend the Cabinet. It's a bit of a subtle difference. It matters in terms of status at Westminster. It doesn't really matter in terms of your significance politically, whether you are in Cabinet or of Cabinet. What is interesting, though, is that only one of Rishi Sunak's supporters is around that cabinet table. Michael Ellis, the Attorney General. He is a Sunak supporter who's made it to the top. Mr. Sunak himself, we are told, was not offered a job and therefore wasn't in the awkward position of having to turn it down, because there's little doubt that his sympathies do not lie with the economic policy that Liz Truss is forced to develop, or wants to develop. Of course, she is forced by circumstances to look at other things, and the big thing she will have to deal with at the moment is the question of energy. She promised on Sunday that she would have a plan within a week. Well, the timetable has tightened somewhat because of public and market expectations, and we are expecting that plan at Westminster tomorrow. Here's what her ally, the new Deputy Prime Minister and Health Secretary Therese Coffey, had to say to journalists this morning.
Well, the Prime Minister set out yesterday on the doorsteps of Downing Street her three main priorities about growing the economy, tackling the energy situation, and indeed the NHS. And in terms of energy, this is a combination of support to households and businesses, but also of supporting making our energy industry to make sure that we have sufficient energy coming through in the future. So both short-term and medium to long-term proposals there. That will be set out this week. That's what the Prime Minister said. You can understand that she's been Prime Minister for less than 24 hours while we've been working on plans in the run-up to this potential event. I think it's important that all the tyres are kicked, as it were, to make sure that we have a robust energy proposal in order, as I say, to set out that can be set out to help households and businesses, and details on that will be coming this week.
That's the Health Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, who, according to the papers, is apparently known as Tiz among her friends, and one of her closest friends is indeed Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, and she's regarded as something of a personal confidant as well as a political one, and they share a passion for karaoke. So who knows, we might get a session before the end of the week. More serious questions for the opposition, of course. How do they position themselves? How do they challenge this new Prime Minister? How can they be sure whether or not she is more or less popular than the man she succeeded, Boris Johnson? Here's the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, one of his party's top team, who was asked about Liz Truss's promises on the energy crisis.
If Liz Truss announces that she's adopting Labour's plans, we welcome that, and the country will welcome that. But we really haven't got the detail. I think what's important, if she is going to freeze bills, is where is the money coming from? Is it actually going to come from consumers, from bill payers down the line, or is it going to come from the oil and gas companies who have made huge profits, more than they imagined, and can actually afford to fund it? So we're going to need to see the detail, I think, in the hours ahead. And second, is she really going to go forward with those unfunded tax cuts, which Rishi Sunak thought were wrong, and certainly we can't understand because they're not at all going to benefit poorer people?
That was David Lammy. Our political correspondent David Wallace-Lockhart is here with me outside number 10. David, the political challenges she faces are considerable. She's barely got time to get her feet under the desk before she's got to make a major policy announcement that some say could determine her political fate.
Yeah, Liz Truss may well have always hoped to be Prime Minister. I don't think anyone would hope to be coming into this circumstance as Prime Minister. Obviously, the economic picture is particularly difficult. First and foremost will be energy bills for Liz Truss. She, throughout the campaign, started off by saying she was going to cut taxes, grow the economy. She felt that was the best way to deal with people feeling that they had a shortage of cash. I think it became evident to her that that was just not going to cut it with the sort of bill increases that people were facing. She has promised a plan within a week. We're hearing that should be coming tomorrow, the idea of freezing bills at some sort of level and essentially, if we believe, funding that gap through borrowing. The difficulty that Liz Truss faces on top of that is, of course, a lot of her campaign was about cutting taxes. And if she's going to give basically a big intervention, pumping billions, tens of billions of pounds into the economy from the government at a point where she also wants to cut everyone's taxes, it can be very difficult to square those two things. So I think she's going to have some sort of, she's said herself, a budget or a fiscal event where she spells out her plans for the economy. But I'm sure they were working to very late in 10 Downing Street and 11 Downing Street, where the Chancellor is, last night, trying to finalise these plans for an energy intervention.
It was very noticeable that we had kind of different stages of the departure, and I presume that is because some ministers were kept back for conversations with the Prime Minister. Noticeable that the last people to leave, quite some time after Cabinet broke up, was Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, and the Government Chief Whip, Wendy Morton, and the Leader of the Lords, Lord True. I mean, that presumably in some ways points to the fact she knows, certainly with the last two, that parliamentary business, getting support in Westminster, in Commons and Lords, is going to be critical. She may have an 80-seat majority, but that often doesn't translate into a majority of votes, a comfortable majority of votes.
Yeah, and as you were talking about there, when you looked at the picture of the cabinet table, she has one person around that table who backed Rishi Sunak. It's very much a cabinet of her own supporters. Now, that's all well and good, but remember, at the final stage of when MPs were voting in the leadership contest, before it went to party members, Rishi Sunak had more backers than Liz Truss. He had more popularity amongst the MPs. So a big question here, I suppose, is how do you get the whole parliamentary party back on side to vote for your proposals, to vote for your plans, to vote for this emergency budget, if that's eventually what it is, when you're not also bringing them back into the fold. We heard a lot of talk about unity after a bruising leadership contest, but it is notable how few Rishi Sunak supporters have made it to the top team. That being said, we do expect Liz Truss to start giving out more junior ministerial jobs today. It's possible a lot more of them will go to people who backed Rishi Sunak, perhaps a bit of a fig leaf there, because she does, if she wants to get her agenda through Parliament, have to unite the party again.
The polling evidence at the moment is that the trend of polls is that Labour is ahead for now. Therefore, presumably, there is a kind of, you might call it enlightened self-interest point here for many MPs who may not like Liz Truss and certainly didn't back her, but she's their best chance of surviving, because if she succeeds, they've got a better chance of holding their seats. I mean, do you think that will press upon MPs?
I think definitely so, and what could be particularly challenging for the next election for the Conservatives is, we talk about the red wall, this area in the north and Midlands and into Wales, traditional Labour seats that Boris Johnson managed to win at the 2019 election. A big part of the Conservative majority is built on these traditional Labour seats. Now, a lot of people thought Boris Johnson, for all his flaws, did have a remarkable ability to win over people who traditionally would not vote for the Conservative Party.
The Carlsberg of Conservative politics.
Exactly. Now, what the jury is still out on is, does Liz Truss have that ability? She probably is seen more in the classic Conservative free market mould potentially than Boris Johnson was, and therefore it will be interesting to see if she can come up with some sort of policies that manage to help her retain these seats. I think so crucial in all of this is the energy policy she comes up with, because if people feel like, even after government intervention, that Liz Truss has not done enough to help them with cost of living, to help them pay their bills, they will, I suppose, look to other opposition parties who have put forward their own plans, like Labour, like the Lib Dems, that they say can freeze energy bills where they are now, and they might think that would have been a better option.
I think I probably meant Heineken, didn't I? The lager that reaches parts other Conservative politicians can't reach. But he did reach those parts, you say, those so-called red wall seats. A lot of that was about the levelling up agenda. And yet you have this quote from Liz Truss on Sunday where she says, the economic debate for the past 20 years has been dominated by discussions about distribution. And what's happened is that we have had relatively low growth. To look at everything through the lens of redistribution, I believe is wrong. I mean, if you're not in favour of redistribution, if you think actually the economy was growing, everybody will benefit, that's not the same as levelling up.
No, it's not. Although in her speech yesterday, she didn't use the term levelling up, but on the steps of Downing Street, she did talk about areas that had been neglected, yes, and wanting to see them getting better services. Liz Truss is basically gambling on the fact that cutting taxes, which she concedes herself benefits the high earners the most. If someone pays very little tax or no tax already, cutting their taxes doesn't really make any difference. But she's hedging her bets on the fact that will grow the economy, that will lead to businesses doing better, it will lead to businesses paying their staff more. She needs all that to happen by 2024 when she plans to have the next general election. That's not a long time to bring about levels of growth that she thinks will benefit people who aren't paying much tax at the moment. So it's definitely an economic philosophy she's committed to, but it feels like it's going to be an economic philosophy on which her success lives or dies.
Let me ask you finally, who matters in this cabinet apart from the Prime Minister herself? Who are the one or two people who you think will be absolutely critical to her success?
I think Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, someone who came into Parliament at the same time, shares a lot of her political views. I think Liz Truss has put a lot of stock in solving problems in the NHS, and I think it's significant that not only as a close political ally to Therese Coffey in that position, she's also got the title of Deputy Prime Minister. I think those two seem to be the crutches that she will rely on while in government.
David Wallace-Arcott, thank you very much. As the heavens open on us in Downing Street, I think they'll be looking for an umbrella for the Prime Minister, because in the next 20 minutes or so, the car's pulled up. She will be leaving Downing Street to go to the House of Commons. We'll be getting that here on BBC Two. And we've said goodbye. And we've said goodbye to viewers on BBC Two. That's it from the news channel for now. I'm going to find an umbrella. Back to you.
Yes, happy to hear that. Lots and lots of rain currently. Thank you very much, Sean. And we'll be back with Sean a little bit later. Now, the former footballer Ryan Giggs is to face a retrial on domestic violence charges. The 48-year-old is charged with coercive and controlling behaviour, as well as 2 counts of assault against his ex-girlfriend, which he denies. A jury failed to reach a verdict at Manchester Crown Court last week. The new trial is expected to go ahead in July next year. Our reporter Matt Graveling is outside Manchester Crown Court. Tell us more, Matt.
Well, it was in court number 7 this morning when the prosecution barrister Peter Wright QC stood up addressing Judge Hilary Manley and said that this matter has been discussed at a very senior level within the Crown Prosecution Service when asking for that retrial. Mr Giggs was not in court today, but he was also under no obligation to attend. Now, it was here last week that a jury made up of 11 people spent almost 23 hours deliberating 3 counts faced by the former Manchester United footballer, but they failed to reach a majority verdict on any of the 3 counts faced by Mr Ryan Giggs. Now, those counts were 1 count of alleged controlling behaviour towards his former partner Kate Greville between August 2017 and November 2020, and 2 counts of alleged assault against Miss Greville and her younger sister Emma Greville at his home in Manchester on the 1st of November 2020. Mr Giggs denied all of the charges. Now, the earliest available date that all of the parties here today said that they could get back in the courtroom to discuss this trial again in its entirety is the 31st of July of next year, with the trial expected to last anywhere between 3 and 4 weeks.
Matt. 4 men arrested in connection with the murder of the 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell have been given conditional bail. Our correspondent Nick Garnett has the latest from Merseyside Police Headquarters.
Well, it's now more than 2 weeks since 9-year-old Olivia was killed by a gunshot fired into her home by an unknown attacker trying to force their way into a house in the Dovecot area of the city. Since then, there have been a number of arrests, and today 4 men have been released from custody. The first of the 4 men was taken into custody in the early hours of Sunday morning. He was being questioned on suspicion of murder. Shortly afterwards, a man was arrested in the Runcorn area and was held on suspicion of assisting an offender, and then 2 other people were arrested. One of them on the M42 motorway near a place called Leamington Spa, more than 100 miles or 160 kilometres away. Police were given more time to question them all, but this morning detectives say all 4 have been released on conditional bail. Meanwhile, yesterday, both of Olivia's parents spoke via Merseyside Police about their 9-year-old daughter. Police are particularly keen still for people to check CCTV footage and dash cams and the cameras perhaps on their doorbells to see if anything of interest is there and to pass it on to the police. But 2 weeks on, the search for those responsible continues.
The police watchdog is investigating the fatal shooting of a man by officers in South London on Monday night. Chris Cabba died after a car chase in Streatham Hill. Our reporter Celestina Olulade was at the scene.
Well, Chris Cabba has been described as loved and super kind. In fact, the mother of his fiancée told the BBC that Mr. Cabba was due to become a father in just a few months' time. So, of course, the family still really trying to come to terms with what has happened, still in shock. But at the same time, there is anger. People are asking questions. Why was Chris Cabba shot by armed police just around the corner from here following a car chase?
People are drawing their own conclusions, looking back at what happened with Mark Duggan, looking back to 2011 and again looking back over the time when we don't get the information that we need about an incident on the basis that it's being investigated. And as I've said, what always happens is, because we're left out of certain pieces of information about the individual involved, usually negative information is put out there and no information about what's happened on the police's side.
Now, the IOPC says it's launched an investigation, and it said that it understands that people want answers quickly, but it's asked the public to give it time to carry out its investigation, and a post-mortem will get underway in due course.
The UN Secretary-General has set out steps for the creation of a demilitarized zone around the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Antonio Guterres told an emergency meeting of the Security Council that Russian forces should leave the area and Ukraine should promise that it will not move its troops in. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow needed more information, but it has repeatedly rejected calls to withdraw its forces from Zaporizhzhia, saying troops are protecting the complex. Our correspondent Hugo Bachega reports from Kyiv.
This morning, we heard from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying that he requested clarification from the International Atomic Energy Agency after that report was published yesterday. He said there is a need for additional explanation because there are a number of issues in the report. Now, the IAEA issued this report after inspectors visited the Zaporizhzhia complex yesterday. The report said the monitors observed damage at different locations at the Russian-occupied facility. Russian military vehicles and personnel are positioned across the complex. And the report also raised concern about the situation involving the Ukrainian staff operating the station. The monitor said the situation is unacceptable because these workers are having to endure high stress and also a lot of pressure. And the report called for the creation of a safety zone around this facility. Now, yesterday at that emergency meeting, Antonio Guterres called for the creation of a demilitarized zone. He's been calling for this zone for quite some time now. He said that Russian military personnel should leave the area of the station and Ukraine should promise that it would not move its troops in. But it's hard to see it happening because so far the Russians have rejected any proposal that it would include Russian troops being removed from this area. And Russia has been saying that Russian troops are there protecting this plant.
Hugo Bachega. Let's go back to the politics because we are going to be listening into Prime Minister's questions in 40 minutes or so. That's the scene in Downing Street. Another rainy day in Downing Street. Liz Truss's second day as Prime Minister because she was, of course, sworn in yesterday, asked yesterday by the Queen at Balmoral to form a government. She's been very busy since then, announcing a new cabinet, and it's a very different cabinet from the one that has gone before. So let's talk a bit more about it with Baroness Anne Jenkins. She's a Conservative peer and co-founder of the Women to Win campaign to increase the number of female Conservative MPs. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And you've pointed out on your Twitter feed that there are 10 female cabinet ministers. It's how do you feel about that?
Well, I'm very pleased, but the point I was making on Twitter is that this doesn't happen overnight. You can't go from being elected in 2019 to being a cabinet minister 2 years later. It involves a lot of investment. It needs a lot of effort from the party for going out to look for the right candidates, to helping them get elected, and then to developing them within government. So that's why the pipeline is so incredibly important. It takes, between 10 and 15 years. We've been going Women to Win for 15 years. Liz Truss was a very early alumni, if you like. And in order to get people get women in, get anybody into a position that they're ready for cabinet, which is after all, a very big job. It takes time, and which is why the importance of keeping your foot on the pedal and getting more women to start the journey in order to get them ready for government and going through the process. So that was the point I was making on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of what you were saying there about Liz Truss being an old alumni of the group, interestingly, also, she is the only survivor around that cabinet table of the past 6 years, having served under David Cameron. So she's had durability through this period.
Yes, and a lot of experience. And as she steps up to the dispatch box to do PMQs, which is, enormous pressure, obviously, you've got to perform, everybody's going to be watching you. But it's worth remembering she's had far more experience, ministerial experience and experience from the dispatch box than Boris Johnson had, for example. But that doesn't undermine the fact that the chamber is a very intimidating place. Women, generally speaking, don't like the sort of adversarial and confrontational politics. Indeed, it's one of the reasons they don't step forward in the first place. And we all know that public speaking is most people's number one fear. So it does take time to get used to the dispatch box. So she will be ready for it, but knowing that the eyes of the world are on you and that whatever you say and whatever you do, you're going to be criticised and every word will be raked over is quite a lot of pressure on top of all the other pressures that she's experiencing.
With the campaign that you co-founded, Women to Win, I mean, you're obviously a passionate champion of equality and diversity, and I'm just wondering then what difference you think the new mix that we see around the cabinet table will make in terms of a dynamic.
Well, I hope that they will listen to women's voices. I mean, I've always said, people say, oh, why does it matter whether it's 25%, which we currently are, or 9%, which we were when we started, when Theresa May and I started Women to Win, and spin that round the other way, and it was 91% men. Certainly not today. But it matters because women's life experiences are different to men. I mean, they're not inferior, they're not superior, but they are different. And you have to have those differences more widely heard, both around the cabinet table, in Whitehall generally. And if you work in a man's world, which I do too, I count every meeting. I go, okay, 45 men, 5 women. That's the norm. But if you're a man, I don't think you notice it. And so there would have been many meetings which happen, and no man in the group will go look round and say, hang on a minute, where are the women? And I think the women always notice it. So I'm very much hoping that having that number of women's voices round the cabinet table will make a significant difference to the deliberations there.
Baroness Anne Jenkin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The Washington Post says some of the classified documents seized at the Florida home of Donald Trump were so sensitive that even the Biden administration's most senior national security officials were not cleared to examine them. According to the Post, such critically sensitive material needs special clearance from the president or a cabinet member. One document reportedly detailed the nuclear capabilities and military defences of an unnamed foreign power. FBI agents conducted the search at Mar-a-Lago last month. Former special counsel to the US Department of Defense, Ryan Goodman, told the BBC that the Washington Post report is significant.
It definitely strengthens the case that this is something that could be potentially charged under the Espionage Act. People are basically behind bars for having handled much less sensitive classified information. And it really does intersect with this recent federal court decision to appoint a special master, because she has stopped in the tracks the ability for the FBI and Department of Justice through their criminal investigation to use any of this material. So they aren't able to do things like look at fingerprints on this document, look at chain of custody on the document. So I think it kind of ups the ante a lot for whether or not the Justice Department decides to try to immediately appeal her decision.